Hey guys, today we have a really special video for you. So if you haven't already heard, we just released our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, and it's available wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And what better way to get you guys a little sneak peek of this incredible piece of art than to tell you one of the new stories that is in this book. Again, our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, is out right now wherever books are sold, so grab your copy today and follow along. And remember, your nightmares are waiting.
We've covered lots of bizarre stories on this channel, but I can say with confidence that today's story is easily one of the weirdest. In fact, it could even be the most weird, because you'll get to the end of the story and hear what happens, the big reveal, and you're gonna be like, wait, what happened? So buckle up, it's a good one. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to clean the like button's house, but instead of cleaning it, just go ahead and bring a wrecking crew to their property and level it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of January 5th, 1909, a 56-year-old reverend named John Carmichael kissed his wife and kids goodbye and then stepped out of his cottage into the cold and wrapped his cloak around his black suit, and then he hopped on his horse and he galloped out onto the road. Reverend Carmichael lived in a rural part of Michigan, and on this day, he was making his way to another town about 9 miles away called Columbus, where he was going to host this big religious revival. Basically, he was going to hold this big sermon and try to get new people to join his church. And so as the Reverend galloped his way down the road, he saw all these kids outside having snowball fights and making snowmen, and it was just really nice. But also, in virtue of being the Reverend, basically everybody in town knew him, and so either the kids wanted to say hi to him or their parents did. And so as the Reverend is really just trying to hustle his way to Columbus, he kept having to stop over and over again to have small talk and play nice. But after about 30 minutes, he had reached a point in the journey where all the houses were kind of behind him, and he had this kind of nice quiet stretch where he knew he wouldn't be bothered by anybody. He had made this journey many times to Columbus, and he always looked forward to this stretch of the road. It was just very peaceful and gave him a chance to kind of just be left with his own thoughts and think about his upcoming sermon and what he wanted to say. And so as the Reverend was having this sort of peaceful time trotting his way down the snowy road, he heard the sound of hooves fast approaching him. And so the Reverend turned around and he saw there was this very rough-looking guy wearing this brown stained shirt with a long overcoat over it, and the guy's hair was slicked back and greasy, and he had this big weird grin on his face, and he was waving wildly at the Reverend, obviously trying to flag him down. Now, inside, the Reverend did not want to talk to this guy, because he knew who this guy was. His name was Gideon Browning, and he lived in the town where the Reverend lived, and he was known for being kind of erratic and had a horrible drinking problem. And frankly, the Reverend just wanted to be left alone. Here he was enjoying his ride, and here comes the town drunk. He doesn't want to be around this guy. But also the Reverend understood that he was the Reverend in town. People knew who he was. He couldn't just be a jerk to people. He had to be kind. And so he smiled at Gideon and waved to him to be polite, but was dreading this interaction with Gideon. And in fact, weirdly enough, the Reverend over the past several weeks had been running into Gideon all over town, to the point where it was becoming weird that he just kept seeing Gideon. And every time he interacted with Gideon, it was just awful, because Gideon was just totally an unpleasant person. But here he was, once again, having to have yet another interaction with Gideon. And as soon as Gideon came right up alongside the Reverend, his first question was, "Hey, Reverend, can I ride with you?" And the Reverend, again, is like, "My goodness, I don't want to do this right now." But he was like, "Of course we can ride together." And pretty much immediately, the Reverend regretted this decision, because Gideon would just not shut up. He just talked the entire time they were supposed to be in this peaceful part of the Reverend's journey. But not only that, the questions Gideon was asking Reverend the whole time they were riding together were sort of invasive. Gideon wanted to know exactly where the Reverend was going and what he was doing there, and, how many churches did the Reverend own, and just all these personal questions. And sort of against his better judgment, the Reverend was being truthful with Gideon. He told Gideon that he was going to Columbus to have this big revival, and he also told Gideon about one of the churches that he owned in a town called Rattle Run. And as the Reverend was again kind of giving up this information that he kind of wished he wasn't, he noticed Gideon began doing something strange. As Gideon was galloping along, keeping a fixed gaze on the Reverend, Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin and began flipping the coin into the air and catching it and flipping it and catching it over and over and over again, never affecting his riding. I mean, it was like Gideon wasn't even aware he was flicking this coin. And the Reverend, he's kind of watching Gideon do this, and it was sort of impressive. Like Gideon was just able to flick this coin over and over and never drop it and just keep on stride. But more than just being impressed with Gideon's hand-eye coordination, the Reverend began to notice that he really liked what Gideon was doing with this coin. It was kind of soothing in a way. Not so much the actual coin flipping in the air, but the sound it was making. The sound of it spinning in the air and slapping into his palm over and over again. It just kind of put the Reverend at ease, and he didn't know why. And so after a while, the Reverend just kind of stopped answering Gideon's questions and just kind of stared at the coin and listened to that sound, and he just felt himself drift into this weird relaxed state, almost like he felt asleep. And so as this weird thing is going on with this coin, the two men eventually reach this crossroads where there's a general store, and at this point Gideon catches his coin, puts it back in his pocket, and the two men, they come to a stop at this general store, even though the Reverend did not want to go to this general store. He just kind of followed Gideon up to the hitching post. They both got off their horses, they tied their horses to the post, and again the Reverend's thinking, I can't stop here, I gotta go to Columbus, I gotta get to this revival. But Gideon just turns to the Reverend and says, hey, we got to make a stop here. We need to get something. And the Reverend found himself saying, okay, what are we going to get? And the Reverend's thinking, what am I saying? I don't want to do this. I don't want to stop here. I got to go. But he just stood there, just waiting for Gideon to tell him what they were going to buy. And Gideon, who had that big grin on his face again, he said, well, actually, I'm not going to go into the store. You are. You're going to go in there, you're going to buy me a new hatchet, and you're going to bring it out here and give it to me. And now everything about this was totally weird to the Reverend. He did not feel like this was a normal request, nor did he want to go in the store. He wanted to leave. But for some reason, he just said, okay. And he turned and shuffled in the store, found a new hatchet, paid for it with his own money, walked outside, handed it over to Gideon. And then at this point, the Reverend just wanted to get on his horse and get away from Gideon. But the second the Reverend got back on his horse to do that, Gideon hopped on his horse and said, hold on a minute, Reverend. We're not done yet. Now we're going to go to your church and Rattle Run, because I'm getting married soon and I'm thinking about maybe getting married in your church and I want to scope it out. And so the Reverend at this, who again just wants to go to Columbus, he doesn't want to be around Gideon at all, but for some reason he just said, okay, yeah, we'll go to my church and Rattle Run. And so at this point, Gideon pulled out his coin and started flipping it again and again, and the two men rode side by side in the direction of Rattle Run. And the whole time, the Reverend's thinking, what am I doing? Why are we doing this? And also, in addition to just brain fog and confusion, the Reverend also realized that Gideon was clearly lying to him because he knew Gideon was married. So what's he talking about needing to scope out his church to see about potentially getting married there? That didn't make sense. Like, why was Gideon actually wanting to go to his church? The Reverend didn't know, but he was really starting to feel scared. But again, he just couldn't stop agreeing to the things Gideon wanted to do. And so the two men galloped their way to Rattle Run. The whole time Gideon's flipping that coin and staring at the Reverend, and the Reverend's just totally transfixed on the coin. And then they get to the church. Gideon puts the coin in his pocket. The two men hitch their horses to the post outside. They go up to the front door. The Reverend unlocks it. They go inside. And sort of automatically, the Reverend walked to the back of the church and he lit the stove. And then as he was walking back towards the front, where Gideon was still standing right in front of the doorway, Gideon suddenly told the Reverend to stop where he was. And so the Reverend stopped in the middle of the church, and he's just looking at Gideon, who's got that coin back out, and he's flipping it up and down again. And at this point, the Reverend just looks at Gideon and says, well, do you want to look around? And Gideon, who's flipping that coin up and down, just says, no, I don't need to look around. There is no wedding. Hey, Reverend, go ahead and lift up your left arm. And at this point, the Reverend is terrified, he's confused, and his left arm just suddenly raised up into the air. He had no control over it. And then a second later, Gideon says, hey, go ahead and raise your other arm. And so the Reverend, who's still got his left arm out to one side, felt his right arm come up to the other side. And so at this point, the Reverend's just standing there with his arms out to the side, and it was at this point that the Reverend understood what was going on. Clearly, Gideon had hypnotized him. That could be the only explanation for what was going on here. But before the Reverend could say or do anything about how totally weird the situation was, Gideon, who was flipping that coin and had a big grin on his face the whole time he was making the Reverend raise his arms up, Suddenly, Gideon's face completely changed, and he became deadly serious, and he was staring at the Reverend, and then he dropped the coin to the ground and began moving towards the Reverend. The following day, around noon, the caretaker for Reverend Carmichael's Rattle Run Church made his way to that church to check in on the building. He knew Reverend Carmichael was going to be in Columbus for a few days, and so he just wanted to make sure, nothing was out of the ordinary. And as this caretaker galloped up to this small white steepled church, he noticed right away there was a column of smoke coming up out of the chimney. Clearly, there was a fire lit inside of the church, and the caretaker's thinking, that doesn't make any sense. The Reverend is not supposed to be here, so who could possibly be in the church right now? And then after the caretaker got up to the front door, he was about to put his key in the lock when he discovered the door was already unlocked. And so instinctively, he put his hand on his pistol on his hip, and then he grabbed the handle and he flung the door open. And when he looked inside the church, he just froze, because the entire interior of the church was drenched in blood. There was blood on the pews, the walls, on the altar, and then also amongst all this blood, the caretaker also noticed there were little pieces of ripped up fabric all over the place, and he saw one of them had a unique button sewn into it, a button he recognized as belonging on Reverend Carmichael's suit. And so the caretaker is horrified. He's looking around. He doesn't see anybody, but he sees there's a drag trail right down the center aisle all the way up to the altar, and it curves around to the right out of view. Now, the caretaker wanted to turn and run away, but he was worried that maybe Reverend Carmichael was in here somewhere and was maybe still alive and he could help him. And so the caretaker felt like it was his responsibility to investigate. And so he drew his pistol and he began walking down this bloody aisle, kind of looking around for any sign of anybody inside the church, but it was deadly silent. And he eventually got about halfway down the aisle when he spotted a silver coin sitting in the middle of the aisle covered in blood, and he kept on walking to where the blood trail turned around the pew, and it led right up to that stove that was obviously still smoldering, and the door to the stove was shut, so the caretaker couldn't see what was inside of it. And so the caretaker just walked up to the stove, and after looking around one more time to make sure nobody else was in here, he opened up the stove, and inside the stove was a human skull. News of Reverend Carmichael's horrific murder very quickly spread all around town and beyond just that town. I mean, this was all over the place. And within 24 hours, there was this huge police investigation that was launched to try to figure out who killed him. And very quickly, the police in Rattle Run spoke to the sheriff of the town where the Reverend lived, and they learned that on the same day that Reverend Carmichael had left to go to Columbus and then obviously was killed inside of his church, well, on that same day, a man named Gideon Browning had this really big blow-up public fight in town, same town as Reverend Carmichael, with his brother-in-law. And this fight was so explosive, lots of people saw it and heard it, and people said after this big fight with his brother-in-law, Gideon had hopped on his horse and rode off angrily. And the kids in that town who were outside that day having snowball fights and building snowmen, they would say that they saw Reverend Carmichael traveling down this road because he talked to all the kids and their parents, and not long after Reverend Carmichael had kind of disappeared down the road, they also reported seeing Gideon Browning coming down the same road, heading in the same direction as Reverend Carmichael. And after that, nobody had seen Gideon since. And so very quickly, Gideon became the #1 suspect in this murder. And basically the thought was, Gideon was so angry from this fight with his brother-in-law that he must have just taken out his anger on the Reverend. Basically, the Reverend was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got killed. Now, the police knew this was a flimsy theory at best, but Gideon had a reputation for being totally erratic and a total drunk, and so it kind of fit with who he was, that this was something maybe he would do. And so within 24 hours of the murder, there was this huge multi-statewide manhunt for Gideon. 3 days later, and 500 miles away from the town of Rattle Run, in a city in Illinois, a man opened the door to a boarding house and stepped inside. And the owner of the boarding house, her name was Miranda Hughes, she was sitting behind the front desk, and when she looked up and saw this man, she had to stifle a gasp, because this man looked absolutely horrible. He was wearing this really dark-stained brown shirt with a long overcoat over it, and he was shivering and skinny and pale and just looked like he was about to die, basically. But the man just walked up to her and said his name was John Elder, and he wanted to rent a room. Now, Miranda, for a second, thought about refusing this guy service, just because honestly, he kind of frightened her. But then again, Miranda thought, you know what? A lot of my guests are pretty rough these days, and this guy's got money and he wants a room, so there you go, I'll give him a room. So she brought him upstairs to a room on the second floor. She opened it up, John stepped inside, and Miranda, as a courtesy, said, hey, do you want me to make you some food? And John, without even turning around, just says, no, I'm fasting, and then he shut the door in her face. For the rest of the weekend, despite what John told Miranda, Miranda would come up to his room and leave food outside of his door at every mealtime. It was something she did for her guests. But John never came out to get the food. And for a little while, Miranda was actually kind of concerned about this guy, considering how terrible he looked. And, now he's fasting. That didn't seem healthy. But at the same time, Miranda was kind of happy to not have to deal with this guy, and so she basically ignored him. But on the morning of January 12th, so 1 week after the murder and 3 days after John Elder had checked into this boarding house, Miranda was walking across the back lawn of this boarding house when she heard what sounded like somebody moaning in pain coming from the outhouse. Now, normally, Miranda would never even think of going to the outhouse and seeing if somebody was okay in there. But the sound this person was making sounded so obviously like they were in pain that she just couldn't help herself. And so Miranda ran to the door of this outhouse and she yelled inside, hey, are you okay in there? And the only sound she heard coming out was more moaning and whimpering. And so acting on a gut instinct, Miranda grabbed the door and flung it open, and what she saw made her scream. It was John Elder, and he was sitting on the toilet looking up at her with wide, panicked eyes, and his throat had been slashed from ear to ear. She could basically see deep into his neck. This was a fatal wound, and he was bleeding everywhere. And so Miranda stumbled backwards, turned around, and ran to go find police. By the time the police arrived at the boarding house and went to the outhouse, John Elder was already dead from this horrible wound. And at first, the police did not connect the death of John Elder to what had happened in Rattle Run 500 miles away. They were totally disconnected. That is, until police searched John Elder and they found in one of his pockets was a blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff of Rattle Run. And as soon as the police read it, they knew they had something huge on their hands, because John Elder was not who he said he was. To understand who John Elder was, and to even begin to understand what happened in Rattle Run, we need to go back to January 6th, the day that Reverend Carmichael left his house and began making the journey to Columbus for this big revival. During that journey, Reverend Carmichael did come in contact with Gideon Browning. Gideon Browning came up alongside him, they rode together, they went to that general store, and Reverend Carmichael did buy that hatchet for Gideon, and they did go to the Rattle Run Church. But the reason they did all these strange activities together is not because Gideon had hypnotized Reverend Carmichael. The actual reason for why they did these things together is even more bizarre. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day, January 6th, Reverend Carmichael was running into Gideon Browning all the time, all over town. It was like everywhere the Reverend went, there was Gideon. And then on January 6th, when the Reverend is making his way down the road, and he turns and sees Gideon Browning coming up alongside him, he's like, oh my goodness, it's happening again. But the way the Reverend handled this was not to say, wow, what a strange coincidence, I keep running into this guy everywhere I go. Instead, the Reverend believed that Gideon must have some sort of special power, that he's able to know where I am at all times, and he's using that power to try to intimidate me by spying on me. And so on January 6th, when Gideon came galloping up alongside of the Reverend's already completely paranoid and on edge about Gideon, fearing this guy has magical powers, basically. And then when Gideon pulled out that coin and began flipping it into the air, which apparently was just something he did, the Reverend took that as, oh my goodness, in addition to having magical powers to always know where I am, Gideon also has the power of hypnosis. And that coin that I can't take my eyes off that sounds so incredible and it's soothing me, well, that is hypnotizing me. Gideon is now controlling me and my thoughts and my body. And so at this point, the Reverend actually believed he was hypnotized, and so he just kind of began going along with anything Gideon wanted. And so it's assumed that Gideon did want to stop at the general store and just kind of said, hey, do you want to stop at the general store? And the Reverend's like, yes, I'll stop at the general store. And then maybe Gideon asked the Reverend, hey, do you mind buying me a new hatchet? And the Reverend's like, yes, I'll buy you a new hatchet. And he goes in, gets the hatchet, comes back out. And then apparently, Gideon said, hey, I want to go check out your church in Rattle Run. And the Reverend was like, yeah, okay. okay, let's go check it out. And then when they got to the church, at some point, the Reverend just went to the middle of the church and put his arms out to either side like he was Jesus Christ nailed to the cross, even though, Gideon had not made him do that. This is the Reverend, caught up in his own delusion. As he's standing there like this, Gideon, who's flipping the coin, fumbles it and it falls to the ground. And the Reverend, who believes that coin has full control over what he's doing, he thought, oh my gosh, the spell is now broken. I need to save myself. And so the Reverend ran and grabbed that hatchet, and he forced Gideon to take off all his clothes, and then he made Gideon hand the clothes over, and once the Reverend had those clothes, he hacked Gideon to pieces and then burned his body in that stove. And then after this horrific murder, the Reverend took his own suit and basically ripped it off and shredded it to bits and then kind of threw it all around the church to make it seem like he had been the one who was killed and that was his skull inside of the stove. And then he put on all of Gideon Browning's clothes, the brown dirty shirt and the long coat, and then he traveled 500 miles to Miranda Hughes's boarding house, where he went inside and booked a room under the pseudonym John Elder. And while the Reverend was hiding out inside of this boarding house, the police in Rattle Run very quickly figured out that the body inside of the church, the skull inside of the stove, and the remains that were in there did not belong to Reverend Carmichael. They belonged to Gideon Browning. And so immediately it went from, Gideon Browning must have done it to no, Reverend Carmichael is the killer and he killed Gideon. But before they could track the Reverend down, Reverend Carmichael, aka John Elder, had gone into that outhouse and slit his own throat. However, when the police searched John Elder's body, so Reverend Carmichael's body, they would find that blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff in Rattle Run, and basically it was a confession. Now, granted, it was the confession of Reverend Carmichael, who genuinely believed Gideon had hypnotized him and had all these special powers, and he basically was acting in self-defense, but nonetheless, it was still a confession to murder. Now, of course, there's lots of details in the story that we can't be totally sure of. We don't really know what the discussions were like between Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning when they met on that road and then eventually made their way to the church and the murder happened. This is basically just the best theory around what happened. Also, it's worth noting that there was a history of mental illness in Reverend Carmichael's family, but this story happened at a time when nobody took mental health seriously, and so it's very unlikely that even if authorities had known about that this crime could have been prevented.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Have you ever wondered what happens when you die? Well, today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that all give insights into what might actually happen. And these are not hokey stories. These are stories with evidence, photographic evidence in some cases. These are deep, unsettling stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and flip all of their wall-mounted TVs upside down. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of December 27th, 1984, a 16-year-old boy named John Boulware sat in the passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep as they drove down a residential road in St. Paul, Minnesota. John's best friend was driving, and 2 more of their friends from school were in the back seat. They were all talking and laughing and singing along to the radio. It was dark outside and it was rainy and kind of an awful night, but John didn't care. He was way too excited because that night he and his buddies were on their way to see the megastar musician Prince perform live. So Prince was obviously a massive, massive star at the time, and anyone at the time would have been pretty excited to go see him perform live. But this was a particularly big deal for John and his friends because Prince was actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota. which was just 20 minutes away from St. Paul where they were from. So it was kind of like they were going to see their hometown hero. Now, John and his friends didn't expect to become, huge rock star gods like Prince. But there was just something about seeing, this hometown guy achieve his dreams on an international scale. It was just really inspiring. And so again, John and his friends are just so stoked about this concert, like they can't wait to get there. And so John, with all this excitement, he turns around to talk to his friends in the backseat about this concert and how great it's gonna be. But right as he turns around, he hears a loud screeching sound, and he whips his head back around just in time to see the headlights of the car aimed at this tree that they're careening straight towards. He screams, he hears his friends screaming, they smash into the tree, and everything goes dark. A few minutes later, a St. Paul police officer named Brian Coyle and his patrol partner pulled up behind the now wrecked Jeep. They'd been on their regular patrol when they'd gotten a call about the car crash. Now, the call hadn't come from anybody in the crash, so they really didn't know what to expect. Now, when Coyle stepped out of his own car and walked towards the wreck, it was raining and dark out and, the visibility wasn't great, but right away he saw there were 3 teenagers who were standing upright outside of the car. Now, they looked pretty shaken up and they visibly had some cuts on their body, but overall, his assessment was they were basically okay. And so while Coyle's partner went to go examine the wreck itself, Coyle walked up to these teenagers. And one of them, through tears, explained to Coyle that he had been driving, and he said he had been just going too fast, and he tried to take a sharp turn, and he hydroplaned, lost control, and they hit the tree. And then the driver said, it didn't matter though how this happened, because what mattered now is his friend, John, is still in the car, and he's not moving. And so Officer Coyle left the teenagers and told them to stay put, and he walked over to the wreck where his partner was, and Coyle, he knelt down and he looked inside the Jeep, and he saw the other teenager, John, slumped over inside the passenger seat, and he wasn't moving. And so Coyle asked his partner, hey, have you checked him? Is he okay? And the partner looked at Coyle and just said, no, he's dead. And so Officer Coyle took a deep breath, and while his partner called for backup and taped off the scene, Coyle went back to John's friends and broke the news as gently as he could. But of course, they were all devastated. The only thing Coyle could do to help them was to call an ambulance to come and take them to the hospital to get checked out. Once the ambulance had taken them away, and once John's body had been removed from the Jeep, Officer Coyle and his partner began to document the scene by taking photos of the crashed car with a camera. Now, this was all standard practice, and so while they did it, they didn't think anything of it. However, about a week later, when Coyle and his partner were reviewing the photos they took, Coyle noticed something shocking. One of the pictures that Officer Coyle had taken was so bizarre that it ended up in newspapers, not only in Minnesota, but all over the country. Even today, 30 plus years later, people are still talking about it. And when you see this photo, you'll understand why. This is the photograph. And if you look at the top right, above the Jeep's open door, you'll see something that could just be a flash of light, but to Officer Coyle and so many others who have looked at this photograph, they say that weird apparition-looking thing above the Jeep looks eerily similar to John Boulware's face, the 16-year-old victim of the car crash. And it almost looks like this photograph captured like the moment of John's spirit departing Earth, like it's showing his final moment in life, like when he died, screaming as the car is about to crash into this tree. One evening in the summer of 1974, a 60-year-old doctor named Julian Kirchick sat beside his backyard pool at his home in Old Westbury, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. It was a quiet, sunny day, and Dr. Kirchick was glad to have some time to relax. He was a surgeon at a local hospital, and he also had a wife and 4 children, so it was not often that he got a moment of peace to himself. And so Dr. Kirchick leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes and tried to relax for a second, when all of a sudden he heard something rustle in the bushes nearby. Now at first he just figured it must be a squirrel or a bird or something, so he didn't even bother opening his eyes, like this is just nature, it's fine. But this rustling sound persisted, and it just wouldn't stop. And so eventually, Dr. Kirchick did open his eyes, and he got up out of his chair to go see what was going on. Now, these bushes were like 20 feet away from the doctor, and so in order to truly investigate, he had to get up and actually walk over there. And so he gets up and he takes a few steps, when he suddenly freezes. Because now, when he's looking at the bushes, he sees there is someone standing, basically in the bushes, a person. But he realized this person was not a normal-looking person. The person was wearing what appeared to be this dark, long robe that covered their whole body. And in fact, the robe kind of obscured their face. It was like they were this dark presence just standing there in the middle of these bushes. And so Dr. Kerchik is just frozen, having no idea how to react to this. I mean, does he call out for help? Does he, chase this guy out of his yard? Like, what does he do here? And as he's standing there transfixed, this person in the robe extends one of their arms, this long, skinny arm, and kind of begins to beckon Dr. Kerchik towards them. And Dr. Kerchik went from being sort of startled to being terrified. This figure basically looked like the Grim Reaper. And it felt like now the Grim Reaper is beckoning him to come with him, to come die, basically. That was the feeling he suddenly had. And it was unbelievably overwhelming. And so Dr. Kerchik is staring, horrified. He blinks for a second, and the man is gone. Over the next few days, Dr. Kerchik obsessed over what he had just seen. I mean, really, it felt like he had just witnessed the Grim Reaper, and worse, that the Grim Reaper was like telling him to come with him. Like he was signaling to Dr. Kerchik that his time on Earth had come to an end, that his death was imminent. That's what Dr. Kerchik is thinking. But Dr. Kerchik, he's a surgeon. He's a man of science and reason, and he can't understand how this could have happened. I mean, even if it was just a hallucination, it was so vivid. It was so visceral. Like, how could this be? What's going on with him? But the problem Dr. Kerchik had was, who's he going to talk to about this? Hey, by the way, I saw the Grim Reaper, and now I'm worried I'm going to die soon. Or maybe somebody in my family's going to die soon, or a patient is going to die soon. Like, who's going to have that conversation with him? But at the same time that he was feeling increasingly isolated because of this, whatever he saw, he couldn't help but feel like it was real, and it was driving him mad. Like, I'm not doing anything, and something bad is imminent. What do I do? And so for months, Dr. Kerchik just carried this incredible weight with him everywhere he went, like this constant sense of unease, until October of 1974. That month, Dr. Kerchik suddenly got sick. He had a fever, and it just wouldn't go away. And so he went to his own doctor for a checkup, and his doctor told him, I got some bad news. That day, Dr. Kerchik was diagnosed with an incurable form of blood cancer. He was heartbroken, but he was not totally surprised, because for him, this sort of felt like a validation of what he'd already seen. Death, the Grim Reaper, had been calling him, and now Dr. Kerchik knew why. Dr. Kerchik would share his story with newspapers, which is how we know about it today. And shortly after sharing his story, Dr. Kerchik would die. Hey guys, I have a really cool announcement for you. So right now, if you head over to shopmrballin.com, you will find brand new limited time merch items on our site. We have the brand new signature Mr. Ballin hat. Okay, you gotta wear that backwards, of course. There's the black version, and also we have the white mesh version as well. Very cool. It's the thumbs up logo. Very nice, cool hat. And then of course, we also have this nifty new flannel color, okay? Yellow. Really fits the vibe of the fall season. Okay, get yourself one of these. But remember, these are limited time items just for the fall, so get them while you can. Again, that is shopmrballin.com. You got the new flannel, the multiple versions of the hat that you gotta wear backwards. Go check it out. Again, shopmrballin.com. Thank you. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 27th, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leniger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and his wife and his 2-year-old son James had just gotten home from church, and now Bruce was just trying to relax. However, it was proving very difficult to relax because as Bruce is trying to sit on the couch and just kind of close his eyes for a second, his son, James, the 2-year-old, has his toy plane, his favorite toy plane, and he is repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he can, saying, plane crash, plane crash, plane crash. And while, of course, James is a kid, he's gonna be loud and noisy and obnoxious, that's what kids do. But for Bruce, he's watching his son do this, and he couldn't help but be really concerned. Because lately, over the past few months, James had become unnaturally fixated, not on planes, but on plane crashes. And even more specifically, James had begun having these recurring nightmares, like 4 or 5 times a week, where he'd wake up terrified and he would say he, James, had just been in a horrible fiery plane crash. And it was like every night. That was the nightmare. And it was like Bruce and his wife didn't even know what to make of this. Like, where's he getting this from? James was a pretty sheltered kid. Like, he wasn't being exposed to, horrible plane crashes, either in movies or TV shows or books. I mean, he's a 2-year-old. It just made no sense that he was having this recurring nightmare. But what made it even more kind of unsettling is that James wasn't just fixated on the plane crash aspect of this nightmare. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife these weird details about the plane crash, because it was always the same plane crash in his nightmare. He began telling his parents that the Japanese shot me down. And Bruce and his wife are like, what is he referencing? Like, is this a World War II reference? But again, he's 2. Like, developmentally, it's not something he would say even if he was exposed to it. Like, it just didn't make any sense. Now, over the past few months that this behavior had really ramped up, Bruce and his wife had taken James to the doctor to say, what's going on here? Like, what's my kid doing? I don't understand any of this. And the doctors were all like, he's a kid. Like, yeah, it's a weird fixation he's got, but he'll grow out of it. Like, don't worry about it. But to Bruce and his wife, it just seemed like James was not growing out of it. He was just getting more and more fixated as time went on. And so as Bruce is sitting there on the couch watching James for the millionth time smash his toy plane into the coffee table and pretend it was this plane crash he couldn't stop thinking about, Bruce decided he had to do something about this. And so over the next couple of months, Bruce, instead of trying to figure out what was wrong with James that was causing him to fixate on this plane crash, instead of doing that, he began sort of like leaning in and asking James to give him more information about whatever he was seeing in his nightmare. Like, give me all the specifics you can possibly recall. And James would eventually let on that it wasn't just the Japanese that shot him down, it was the Japanese military. And also, the type of plane that James was flying in apparently was a Corsair plane. Bruce had never heard of that before, and again, he's looking at his 2-year-old son thinking, how do you even know what a Corsair plane is? But nonetheless, that's what James said. And so Bruce doesn't know what to do with this information, but again, he's just trying to learn. And so in November of that year, Bruce found himself sitting in the living room, and he had this World War II coffee table book that he'd actually purchased for his father, but he hadn't given it to him yet. And he saw James, playing with his plane, smashing it into the coffee table. And Bruce, he grabs this coffee table book full of pictures of pilots and combat and war, and he flips to pictures of pilots from World War II. Because now, Bruce is thinking, maybe my son somehow is imagining a scene from World War II. A pilot has crashed in World War II, the Japanese military shot them down, I don't know. No idea how he got this image, but that could be what he's thinking about. And so he's like, well, maybe I'll just start looking at pictures from World War II of pilots, and maybe somehow or another James will look at this and something will click for him. Bruce really didn't know what he was trying to get out of this, but either way, he called James over and he shows him this book. And he's like, James, do you recognize any of these planes? Like, are any of these planes the Corsair plane that you flew, in your dream? Is any of this stuff sort of lining up with your dream? Again, he's talking to a 2-year-old, but the 2-year-old sort of got it. James looked at the pages, but nothing clicked. James sort of reached down and was just kind of flipping through all the pages, and there was nothing. There was no connection with James. But towards the end of the coffee table book, where Bruce is thinking, like, what am I even doing here? I'm like prompting my 2-year-old to research World War II with me. Like, what is this? What is going on here? But as James is flipping the pages, he suddenly stops and he points at one of the pages and he says to his dad, that's where I was shot down. And he's pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so Bruce, again, he doesn't really know what he's trying to accomplish here, but, clearly his son has pointed out this particular fact that's sort of roughly tied in with the other things he's brought up. He's had this dream about being a pilot who crashes because the Japanese military shot him down. He's highlighting a battle in Japan during World War II where, the Allies were fighting the Axis powers and the Japanese, could have been shooting somebody down. So it sort of made sense. Okay, fine. Maybe my son's dream is about something that happened at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Don't know how this even happens. Don't know how this is possible, but I'm going to do some research. And so that's what Bruce does. He begins researching the Battle of Iwo Jima. Doesn't even really know what he's looking for, but he just wants to see if there's anything connected to what his son has been saying. And what he eventually discovers actually is sort of a relief. He discovers that there is no record of any Corsair airplanes crashing during the Battle of Iwo Jima. In fact, no Corsair planes at all were flown during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And his son James had been saying specifically, I flew a Corsair plane. Like that was the plane that crashed. And so he's thinking, okay, there's a hole in my son's story. Like he clearly must have latched on to some event somehow. Somebody said it to him, he heard it, whatever it is. And in his 2-year-old mind, he sort of warped it and that's what he believes happened, but it's not real. Like he's not actually recalling something that happened in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Like this is just, a false memory or something. However, Bruce was unable to definitively find the names of pilots who actually flew in the Battle of Iwo Jima. He wanted to find if there was any pilots named James who potentially crashed, during that battle, but he just couldn't find the information. Maybe it existed somewhere, but he couldn't find it. And so Bruce had this idea to get in touch with this old veterans group. All these old guys who had served in the Battle of Iwo Jima that were still alive. They were based out in San Diego, and they got together periodically and just sort of had social hours and stuff like that. And Bruce, he goes out to San Diego, and under false pretenses, he basically tells the group that he's shooting a documentary about the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he needs some information, about certain pilots that flew during the battle. He goes out there, and he goes to one of their social events, and he begins asking around, asking if anybody knew about any pilots named James who were shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And basically all the men he talked to directed him to go talk to the group's historian, this one guy who kind of had all the information about what had happened during this battle. And so Bruce goes over to this guy and he starts asking him questions about, any pilots that, were shot down during the battle, do you know? And the historian, he tells Bruce that, during that battle, virtually no planes were shot down. However, there was one plane that was shot down. A single US Air Force pilot was shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he was killed. And that pilot's name was James Houston Jr. Bruce couldn't help but be truly shocked that the only pilot shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima happened to be named James. Like, that just seemed like a coincidence that couldn't be possible, considering what his son was saying. And so suddenly, Bruce doesn't know what to make of this information he's been given. For so long, his 2-year-old son, named James, has been talking about how in his dream he's been shot down by the Japanese military during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And now he's being told there was a single pilot shot down in real life during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name was James? Like, how is that possible? That just seems impossible. And so at this point, Bruce is really holding on to the fact that his son had said his plane that he was shot down in was a Corsair plane. And this guy, James Houston Jr., who was shot down, the plane he was shot down in was not a Corsair plane. And so Bruce is telling himself, like, okay, this is just a crazy coincidence. Like, this didn't somehow happen to my son. He's not like channeling somebody else who died years ago. Like, that can't be what's happening here. This is just a wild set of circumstances. That's all this is. But he's freaked out now. And so he calls his wife and he tells her about what he's learned, and he kind of downplays how much this has really unsettled him. But he ultimately tells his wife, and the two of them decide, okay, you know what? Let's just do a little bit more research and just figure out what's going on here. Like, this is just so crazy. We got to do a little bit more research. And in doing research about James Houston Jr., they discover that James has a sister who is still alive. And so they decide to contact her. Not really even sure what they're going to say, but they figure, you know what, let's just get in touch with her and just tell her what's going on. Who knows? Maybe somehow she can explain this. Who knows? And so kind of on a whim, James and his wife, they send a message to this woman, to the sister. And the sister, when she finds out there's this 2-year-old who's sort of referencing her brother's death in some way, for whatever reason, her reaction was to send actual physical photographs of James Houston Jr. when he was a pilot, when he served in the military. She just sent a whole bunch of pictures to Bruce, his wife, and James to look at. Like, there really wasn't a clear set of what do we do now, and so that's what she did. Here are some pictures. And when Bruce looked at these photos, it was like his whole world was completely rocked. Because in one of the photos that clearly showed James Houston Jr., he is standing in front of a plane, and that plane was a Corsair plane. And so at this point, for Bruce, it felt like the set of circumstances, the coincidences here, were simply too much to ignore. This is no longer coincidence. This is something else. And also, there's one other small detail that now was sort of bubbling up in Bruce's mind, and that was, periodically, his son James would talk about how he really wasn't named James. He was named James III. Just periodically, his son would say that. Not every time, but he brought it up enough that it was sort of a known thing, that he was James III. And now Bruce is thinking, James Houston Jr.? That's James II. My son? How could he possibly know all these things that happened to James Houston Jr. if he was not James III, James Houston Jr.'s reincarnated soul? Bruce would eventually take his son's story to the news, and the family would film a primetime segment on ABC about it. James was soon invited to the Battle of Iwo Jima Veterans Reunion, where he would shock the group with his knowledge of the battle. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, and when he did, he called her by a nickname that only her late brother ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit had come back to Earth in James III. If reincarnation is real, James's story is one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories that both have very unexpected killers. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a brand new signed copy of Mr. Ballen's brand new graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live. But make sure you first rip out one page from each story. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. And this was really exciting for her. I mean, she had just moved out on her own for the first time. It feels like she's an adult here. And so today was a big day. She looked herself in the mirror and made sure her look was just right. She gathered up all her books and her journals and all the stuff she would need. And then once she was ready, she began heading towards the door. But before she got there, she heard a knock on her door. And Ashley felt sort of confused, like she hadn't lived here long enough for people to actually know she lived here, so who would be coming to visit her? And she certainly didn't have any plans to see anybody today. And so she's thinking, like, I have no idea who could be at my door right now. So she walks to the door, she opens it up, and she is truly shocked now to see who's standing there. But her shock quickly turns into fear. So there were two police officers standing in the hallway looking right at Ashley, and the looks on their faces were very serious. Now, Ashley, the reason she felt so scared when she saw these police officers was not because she had, done something wrong. It was because in her life, before she got to college, she had experienced some pretty severe trauma. So her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and it had been very traumatic for her. It sort of threw the family for a loop. And then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather, who had, raised her from that point on, he had sort of struggled with depression on and off, and it seemed like he was doing okay, but not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. And so once again, Ashley and her family's lives were turned upside down. And so in many ways, Ashley had not really recovered from those two losses. Those happened not that long ago. And now she was out here on her own, trying to be an adult, trying her best to stay composed. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers that they were there to tell her that, somebody else close to her had died. But when the officers actually began speaking to Ashley, it was clear they were not here to notify her about, a new death, but but they were here to talk about her family. They told her that they were there to speak to her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years earlier. And so when they said that to Ashley, she was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they told her that, Ashley, we exhumed your father. And it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, when these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley was left feeling completely distraught. I mean, number one, she's just found out that there is suspicion that her father was killed by somebody, but worse than that was these two officers who had been here were not here to console Ashley. They were here to effectively interrogate her. They were looking into the family to see if, Ashley was involved in what happened to her father. And so for Ashley, this had really caught her off guard. She felt like she was stammering and confused in all of her answers, which only made her seem more suspicious. And it was like every little misstep she had, the police would dial in and ask even more pointed questions. And by the end of it, she was just sobbing and telling them, like, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. And so eventually the police had gotten up and left. But they told Ashley they were going to be in touch, and then they were gone. And so Ashley's just left there in her room, wondering what she's supposed to do now. She thought about, sucking it up and just going to class, but she's thinking, like, how can I possibly focus on class right now when I've just learned what I've learned and had this horrible experience with the police? And so Ashley ended up calling her mother, and her mother was obviously very upset when she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. And Ashley quickly learned that her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day, that she had also been told that, her husband apparently had been killed and they were now investigating her to see if maybe she had something to do with it. And so the two women just sort of cried on the phone and they began saying, like, I just don't understand, like, who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, they've got to be wrong. Like, none of this makes any sense. And so eventually Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home, forget about classes, we can deal with that stuff later. Just come home, be with your family. Ashley agreed that was the most reasonable thing to do here. And so she grabbed her stuff, she left the dorm, hopped in her car, and she drove the hour back to her mom's place. And when she gets there and she goes inside, the first person she sees is actually her younger sister, Bree, who was 16 years old. And Bree's eyes were red. She obviously had been crying. And, in the first couple of seconds they spoke, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a sort of rough interaction with police as well that day. And so it's like the whole family has been thrust into this chaotic moment that none of them can make any sense of. On the one hand, it's like, who would want to hurt dad? But on the other, it's like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Like, why did they exhume his body in the first place? Like, what's going on here? There was just so much unknown. And so that afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen. And there they mostly cried together and just sort of talked through this horrible situation. But eventually, later in the day, when the tears had sort of stopped flowing and reality had set in, that this was now a very complicated situation, if nothing else. I mean, basically, they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their father/husband, and they sort of didn't know what was going to happen next. But there was a lot of stress around, the next couple of days. They didn't know. And so under all this stress, Stacy, the mom, was like, you know what? I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? And Bree was only 16 and she declined. But Ashley said, sure. She was 20, not 21 yet, but she was drinking at this point, and so she said, yep, I'll take a drink. And so Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. And so for the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen having their drinks and trying hard not to let this horrible situation totally wreck them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up inside of her mother's house, she found she was really hungover. Now, she obviously had had some drinks the night before with her mom and her sister, but she was thinking to herself, like, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate. Like, she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. But Ashley was wondering if maybe part of the reason she felt so bad was not just a hangover. Maybe it was like this emotional fallout from this horrible thing that happened the day before. And so Ashley, she's laying in bed feeling so bad, and she's just convincing herself that I just need to get up, I need to go to my classes, I need to sort of treat the day like a normal day and sort of get my life back together and be ready to potentially deal with police or, whatever else is going to happen here. And so Ashley sort of wills herself out of bed. She's got a blinding headache. She feels horrible, but nonetheless, she takes a shower, she gets herself together, And before long, she's saying bye to her mom and sister, and she's driving back to the campus. And when she gets there, she still feels terrible, but, she goes to her classes, and she does her best to focus, which really turned out to be a gargantuan task, but she did it. And then finally, at the end of the day, during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog, this hangover fog that she was in, and she began sort of feeling normal again. And so by the time she left the lecture hall and was done for the day, she actually felt good enough that she hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And that night, again, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen, just sort of having this cathartic moment together, crying together, talking about their dad, sharing memories, sharing theories, and also having a few drinks. And again, Bree did not have any alcohol, but Ashley and her mother did. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, once again, her head was pounding. She was so hungover, way worse than the day before. Except when she opened her eyes and kind of looked around, that really was not the first thing that hit her. The first thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. The room looked different. And as she kind of adjusted and looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. And so Ashley began to panic and began looking around for her family or anybody she recognized, but nobody that she knew was in there. There were just these 2 police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And these 2 officers, when they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and they walked over to her and they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed at her mother's house that morning, and Ashley had been unresponsive. And so her mother had called an ambulance and they had rushed her here, and luckily she was stabilized now, but apparently she was very close to full-blown organ failure. Like, she almost died. It was very lucky she got here when she did. But before Ashley could ask any questions, well, what was it that was causing my body to shut down? Like, what's going on here? These 2 police officers kind of looked at each other, and then one of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket and they handed it to Ashley. And they said, you need to explain yourself. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to say, why would somebody take their own life that way? Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. That's not a good first choice if you're gonna take your own life. And so as suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, well, the biological father died just a few years before, and apparently he died of a heart attack, but maybe we ought to make sure, because we're basically suggesting that maybe somebody did this to the stepfather. Is it possible somebody, killed the biological father? And so they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. And so now, fast forward to the hospital where Ashley has woken up. These officers have walked over to her, they've handed her a note and told her to explain herself. And this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. So this was a suicide note / confession. And at the bottom of this note, it was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men, and then when police began poking around saying, what's going on here? We think somebody killed this guy and maybe him too. Well, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced those alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with all these painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering these 2 men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day, feigning that she had just found her daughter unresponsive, because the ambulance, they showed up and first responders, they saved Ashley's life. Narrowly. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she showed up at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she would die behind bars in 2016. Around lunchtime on March 31st, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John Schmeier was sitting at a table with a bunch of his friends inside of a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. So John was a retired eye doctor. He'd had a very successful career, made a bunch of money, And his friends that were at this table with him were also, pretty successful guys, sort of like mid to upper tier professionals with very successful careers too. But what they were doing today had nothing to do with career. This was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific group of friends who were very, very close, they would meet up, a couple times a month at this particular Hooters. They would sit at the same table, they would order the same things. They loved it. It was sort of like their little clubhouse. And in fact, they had even come up with a name for, this group of friends. They called themselves the Orange Shorts Society. And so the reason they did that is because Hooters has a sort of vibe to it that if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, basically the waitresses dress in very scantily clad clothing, and they all wear these sort of iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. And so basically these men were sort of joking that they were the Orange Short Society because of the shorts these women would all wear. And so that afternoon, John and the rest of the members of the Orange Short Society all sat around chatting and, BSing with each other, just being guys. And at some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was accustomed to him bringing up, and that was his ex-wife, Monica. So all of his friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but then they got divorced in 2003, so 7 years earlier. But still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. And, he understood that that comes with the territory of divorce. It is what it is. But Monica had made the way John paid her the alimony really cumbersome. And John was convinced, as he would tell his buddies in the Orange Short Society, that it was totally intentional, that she had made it cumbersome. She wanted it to be hard. She didn't like John, and she was punishing him. And so what Monica did is she made John literally each week take cash out of an ATM, put it in an envelope, and then physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She would not accept payment any other way. And the reason she was able to do that is because she claimed she did not have a bank account, and she couldn't be forced to make a bank account. And so either John made these cumbersome payments in cash, or he risked not making the payment at all, and then she could come after him legally. And so he was sort of trapped, making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, who he really couldn't stand. Now, their divorce was not super contentious. The two of them just sort of drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. And actually, Monica really didn't like the whole Orange Short Society thing. She thought it was totally scummy and that John and his buddies were just kind of gross for going to that restaurant and sort of making jokes about, what these women are wearing and making that part of their identity, the Orange Short Society. She didn't like it. And so they just kind of drifted apart. That was all it was. But now it had become this sort of bitter feud between the two of them. And so at the same time that John and his buddies in the Orange Short Society are sitting in the restaurant and John is going on his tirade once again about Monica's alimony, simultaneously on the other side of town, police rushed to Monica's house. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call that came from Monica's house, but when the operator answered, there was no answer. And so by protocol, they had just sent first responders out to the house to see if whoever had called was okay. And so the police, they get to Monica's house, they park, they go right up to the front door, they're knocking on the door, there's no answer, they're looking around, there's no sign of forced entry, no sign of anything really going on here. It's just a quiet day in the neighborhood. But they go to the door again, they knock a few more times, and when there's no answer, they try the doorknob, and it's unlocked. So they open the door up, and right away, they look in, and there's Monica. And she's dead on the ground with the phone right next to her, and she's been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demagon, along with his team, began to survey the crime scene. And they quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. And then they also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body that clearly seemed to be from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had really nothing to do with the body. It was all the money that they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. There were these envelopes in trash cans and drawers on tables. I mean, it was kind of like all over the place, some out in the open, some hidden, but there was lots of money stashed in this home. And so Demagon and the other investigators began to wonder if, okay, maybe this was a robbery and Monica got killed in the process. But it's like, okay, if it was a robbery, why is there so much cash out in the open, literally packaged up in envelopes, easy to, remove from the house? Why is it all here? It's almost like no cash was taken, or certainly not very much was taken, and also other valuables are still in place. It didn't have the feel of somebody ransacking the house. It just sort of felt like somebody came in here and killed Monica. Detective Demagon and his team searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any sign of forced entry. So basically, whoever came in here and did this either, just walked in because a door or window was unlocked, or maybe Monica let them in, maybe she knew who they were, or they had a key. Detective Demagon asked the forensics team to begin sweeping the house for DNA to see if maybe they could find something that could show them who had been here lately. And so while that team got started, Demagon continued to walk around the house, and he eventually found a Rolodex, which is basically like a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. And as the detective was flipping through that book, that was how he discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John Schmeier. That evening, Detective Demagon and another investigator rolled up to John Schmeier's house. They walked up to the front door and they knocked, and then a moment later, the door opened, and John was standing there looking very surprised. So in homicide cases, generally speaking, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. And so even though Demagon didn't really have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that this was her ex-spouse, and so therefore, he is suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demagon and his partner introduced themselves and said they'd like to come in and speak to John. So John said, okay, come on in. So they walked inside, they sat down, and then once they were seated, Detective Demagon watched John very closely as he told him why they were there. Basically, your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it. Detective Demagon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or maybe a subdued reaction. Whatever reaction he might have could be telling to how involved he maybe was or wasn't in this case. When Demagon told John that Monica had been shot to death, John's reaction was huge. His eyes went wide, he clutched at his chest like he was having a heart attack, and then he kind of leaned forward and began sobbing. But when he came back up again, the detective noticed there were no tears in John's eyes. It was just this sort of huge reaction, but Demagon couldn't really tell if it was genuine or not. He also didn't have a baseline for John. He didn't know if this was normal, but this seemed really dramatic, almost like he might be acting. So instead of trying to console John, Demagon just asked point blank, where were you earlier this afternoon at the time of the shooting? And when he asked this, John, who still was sort of rocking back and forth and grabbing his chest and acting very upset, he suddenly stopped, put his hands by his side, and just said, oh, I was at Hooters with my friends. A few days later, Detective Demagon went to the Hooters, where John and his friends would always meet up, and he asked the manager to see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day of the shooting. So by this point, Demagon had actually already interviewed all of the friends who had been at the Hooters with John, the so-called Orange Shorts Society, and he had asked them all about John. Like, had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all said John absolutely was there the whole time. Like, there's no way he could have left and done anything to Monica. He was here with us. I promise you he was here. Now, they would admit to the detective that, John did speak disparagingly about Monica. He would talk about how mad he was about her alimony, and he definitely didn't like her very much. But that was it. That was the extent of his hatred. Now, despite how convincingly these friends said John was there the whole time, he couldn't have done this, Demagon still needed proof. He needed to really see that John had been here when he said he was here. So John went to the manager, they pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday, and wouldn't you know it, there's John. He comes in, he sits down, he's with his buddies, and he is there the whole time, during the time that Monica was killed. And so at this point, Demagon did feel like it sort of was impossible that John actually went and killed Monica. But given the contention between them, John apparently really doesn't like Monica. He hates making these payments to her. Like, there's obvious friction that comes up at these Orange Short Society meetings all the time. Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off, had a bunch of money, maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him. maybe he hired a hitman. And so over the next week or so, Demagon and his team began exploring this hitman lead, and they found that John had been taking out a whole bunch of cash over the last several weeks. But it sort of lined up with how much cash he owed Monica in the form of alimony, and they knew he had to, per Monica's orders, deliver this alimony payment in cash to her in these envelopes, and they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house, and so it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking money out to give to Monica. And so John was basically Demagon's only suspect at this point, and there was basically no evidence against him. And so Demagon knew he really needed to look into other leads here, like the John lead kind of going nowhere. And so he and his team began looking into local gang activity and, crimes in the area. Could this have just been random or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of looking for any connection anywhere in the area, there wasn't one, and the case kind of came to a stall. And so at this point, Demagon decided that the only thing he could do realistically was just kind of start over, go back to square one, and basically re-examine all the evidence all over again. And that included going back and looking at the security footage from the Hooters on that Wednesday when the Orange Short Society was there. And so Demagon, he sat down, he starts watching this tape over and over and over again. It's like the 1,000th time he's looked at this grainy footage, and suddenly something stands out to him. Something he missed all the other times he looked. And as he replayed the footage over and over again, he realized he now knew almost certainly what happened to Monica. It would turn out the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John Schmeier did not kill his ex-wife, nor did he hire a hitman to do it. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. In particular, he resented the fact that she was making him deliver all this cash to her to pay his alimony payments. It just felt totally cumbersome. But that meant John, on a regular basis, was telling these men in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flush with cash. He was giving her tons of cash every single week. This woman has so much cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a man named Tim Jacoby, decided, you know what? I'm gonna go to Monica's house and I'm gonna take that cash. Demagon had been operating under the assumption that all the men who were present on that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, that was the totality of the group. Those were all the members. Because the way the men talked about their group was they all meet up every single time. Same group, same seats, same restaurant. And so Demagon assumed, okay, then it's the same people. This is it. This is the totality of the group. Everybody is accounted for. But no. On the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was not present. Tim Jacoby. And that is the discrepancy that Demagon caught when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized, wait a minute, there's another guy. I heard another guy's name, Tim Jacoby. He's not here. Police would later tie Tim to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her, but when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then fled without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
7 দিন ধরে তাহলে কোথায় যাওয়া আসা করো তুমি?
কি বলতেছো, আমাকে সাসপেন্ড করছে?
মা ফোন করেছিল, সীমন্তের বিয়ে 13 তারিখ। মা একা হাতে
ফজরের নামাজ পড়তেছিলাম, পড়ে যখন উঠলাম তখন দেখলাম অবন্তী সুটকেস নিয়ে। বাবা, তুই আমার একমাত্র সন্তান, আমার খুব শখ ছিল তোকে আমি নিজে
মিস করেছি বলেই আজকে যখন তুমি দ্বিধা দ্বন্দ্ব পেরিয়ে এই গেট দিয়ে ঢুকলে।
কি ব্যাপার, এভাবে তাকিয়ে আছো কেন? আচ্ছা, আমি কিছু একটা ব্যবস্থা করছি।
তোমাকে কিচ্ছু করতে, এবার কি আমি আমার হাতের কাজটা শেষ করতে পারি?
তুমি একা কেন করবে? আমি তোমাকে একটু হেল্প করি। কি ব্যাপার, তুমি এখনো ফ্রেশ হও নাই কেন?
ফ্রেশ হব, কিন্তু ভাবছিলাম
আপনি ঠিক মতো শুন, আপনার হাত পা একটু আমি টিপা দিই।
থাক, টিপতে হইব না, যা তোর বলতেছে যা।
আরে আমি আছি তো।
হ্যাঁ।
আমার এই জীবনে না আর কোনো কিছু করার কোনো মরদ নেই, আমার কোনো জায়গাই নেই।
কেন কথা বলবো না? 100 বার কথা বলবো। কোন সংবিধানে লেখা আছে যে ব্যাচেলরদের বাসা এক কাদা ধুলার আস্তরণ আর ভাজিন? তুমি আমাকে বলেছিলে তুমি আমাকে আগলে রাখবে। তোমার কথায় আমি সব ছেড়ে এক কাপড়ে আমার ঘর।
মা তো প্রায় সময়ই থাকে আমার সাথে। মা তো একটু গ্রামের বাড়ি গেছে, চলে আসবে, টেনশন নেওয়ার কিছু না। না খেলে কিন্তু আমার অনেক কষ্ট হবে।
তোমার মা যেগুলো বলে সেগুলোতে বুঝে আমার কষ্ট হয় না? আপনি যে আমার ছোট ছোট বিষয়গুলোতে এত খেয়াল রাখেন, এতেই আমার ভালো লাগে। গত 7টা দিন তো দেখলাম, একটা বারও তোমার মুরদ হয়নি উপরে উঠে এসে কথা বলার, সরি বলার। আপনি প্লিজ এখান থেকে চলে যান, আপনি আমাদের মাঝে কথা বলবেন না।
তুমি বাড়াবাড়ি করছো।
বাড়াবাড়ি আমি করছি মানে?
তুমি কষ্ট পেয়েছো, রাইট?
আমি মোটেও কষ্ট পাইনি, আমি বরং একটু অবাক হচ্ছি।
সব কিছু তো একদম সুন্দর মতো গুছিয়ে ফেলেছো। হ্যাঁ, একদম সংসারে হয়ে গেছে না?
আমি ন্যাকামি পছন্দ করি না, যা বলার সোজাসুজি বলো। এ কি, আমি তো কিছু বলাই হইনি।
আচ্ছা, ওটা শুনবো আরেকদিন। তুমি একটু খাও, মাছ দিচ্ছি তোমাকে, নাও।
বাসাটা ছোট হলেও আমাদের 3 জনের থাকতে কোনো সমস্যা হয় না। কি হয়েছে মা বলো তো? তুমি তো কখনো এভাবে কথা বলো না।
না মানে